Let's jump right in. In this explainer, we're going to unpack the dense, frankly mind-bending literary depths of an ancient text. We're talking about a text that makes the ultimate claim that the eternal God actually became a human baby. It's a massive, world-altering concept, and we're going to map out exactly how the author structured this radical idea. Just imagine the sheer paradox of that for a second. An almighty creator shrinking down into a fragile infant. I mean, it completely breaks all the rules of logic and ancient philosophy. But today, we'll discover how the opening lines of the Gospel of John try to capture this impossible reality. Because this text doesn't just tell a story, it builds this incredibly intricate theological argument. All right, here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the Gospel's blueprint, move into the hidden literary structure, explore word, light, and creation, then look at how the creator becomes creature, and wrap up with deity, humanity, and rejection. Part 1. The Gospel's blueprint. Okay, to really grasp the prologue, we first have to see where it fits inside the grander architecture of the Gospel of John. So we kick off with a prologue in chapter 1, which leads into the Book of Signs from chapters 1 through 12. Then comes the Book of Glory in chapters 13 through 20, and finally, the epilogue. But here's the really fascinating part. There is a massive shift right after chapter 12. During the Book of Signs, Jesus is out there interacting with the broader world, but then the doors close. The audience suddenly shrinks down to this intimate setting with just 12 disciples, because as the text points out, his hour to depart to the Father has finally arrived. And this whole structural blueprint rests on one absolute foundational concept: the Incarnation. Now, what does that actually mean? Well, it means the eternal God took on a complete human nature. We're not talking about a spirit just super indwelling or possessing some existing person. No, he actually became human. This core idea is explicitly laid out right here in the prologue, and then it's just completely assumed everywhere else in the text. Part 2. The hidden literary structure. So let's look at the ancient literary device John uses to hide a map of this profound theological claim. The author isn't just randomly throwing thoughts onto a page. Instead of a standard linear A, B, C pattern that we're used to, he uses an inverted parallelism. It's called a chiasm. Think of it like a literary boomerang, an A, B, B prime, A prime structure. It brilliantly builds narrative tension by essentially reversing the second half, which acts like a giant arrow pointing straight to the central climax of the whole text. And you can literally see that structure play out perfectly right here. Step 1 introduces the Word in verse 1. Then step 2 introduces the light in verse 7. But now, instead of moving on to a new idea, it inverts. Step 3 jumps back to the light coming into the world in verse 9. And finally, step 4 mirrors the very beginning with the Word becoming flesh in verse 14. It gives us this highly satisfying payoff that sets up the essential precondition for the entire gospel, the miracle of the Incarnation. Part 3. Word, light, and creation. Now, right inside that chiasm we just looked at, the text uses two incredibly powerful metaphors to describe the Son, and both of them are deeply rooted in the Genesis 1 creation account, the Word and the light. Think about it. Just as we use words to communicate our inner thoughts, the author calls the pre-incarnate Son the Word, meaning he is the definitive utterance and the ultimate revealer of God. On the flip side, we have the light. Light is what lets us see, right? So here, the Son is the illuminator giving spiritual sight to a spiritually blind world. And spoiler alert, this theme gets literally demonstrated later on when Jesus actually heals a man born blind. Which leads us to this famously dramatic quote: "The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." Here's the key takeaway, though. In this text, darkness isn't just some passive lack of understanding. It's not innocent ignorance. In John's framework, darkness represents active, aggressive sin. It's this intense, willful hostility that literally wants to snuff the light out. Part 4. The creator becomes creature. Let's push to the very center of that chiasm we mapped out earlier, because this is where the text makes its most heavily debated claims. People have argued for centuries over how to translate verse 9, and depending on the Greek, you end up with two entirely different theological systems. Some scholars, like Dr. Peterson, translate it as the true light was coming into the world, which makes it a literal, historical statement about the Incarnation. But others, like those in the Wesleyan tradition, translate it as the light enlightens every man as he's coming into the world. They see this as universal, prevenient grace, meaning God's grace gets there first, giving all of humanity the ability to believe. It is wild how one sentence structure can shape such massive theological views. But honestly, regardless of where you land on verse 9, we eventually hit verse 14.
And this is the undisputed, bald climax of the whole thing. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The definitive speech of the Creator literally became a human being.
And the specific language used here, it's incredibly intentional. The Greek word is sarx, which means complete, earthy, physical flesh. You really have to understand just how shocking, almost offensive this would have been in the ancient world. It totally rejected the popular Greek philosophy of the time, which viewed the physical human body, and especially the womb, as contaminated and filthy. By claiming the divine word became sarx, the text deeply, aggressively sanctifies human flesh and human motherhood. Part 5. Deity, Humanity, and Rejection. As we wrap up our walk through this literary map, we slam right into the profound paradoxes of the Creator's identity and the world's tragic reaction to him. There's a massive debate around verse 1 regarding the word's identity. Some groups, like the Jehovah's Witnesses, translate verse 1 to say the word was a God. They point out that the Greek word theos is missing a definite article there. However, other scholars point right back to verses 6 and 12, where theos is also missing the article, but is consistently translated simply as God. It's just a prime example of how deep dives into ancient Greek grammar continue to fuel major theological divides today. And that brings us to the ultimate tragedy of the text. Verse 11 says, "He came to his own home, and his own people did not receive him." Really sit with the weight of that for a second. The carpenter made the world before he ever picked up a hammer, yet when he walked into his own handiwork, he was completely rejected by the very people he created. All of this builds into the core paradoxes of the entire prologue. Think about it. The eternal creator who made absolutely everything becomes a finite creature. The ultimate life giver from Genesis will eventually experience the stench of human death. The illuminating light is actively hated by a hostile darkness, and the omnipotent, almighty God shrinks down into a fragile, dependent baby. So as you reflect on this explainer, I want you to consider this final mystery. If the almighty creator was truly willing to enter his own creation, taking on flesh, knowing full well that he would be hated and completely rejected by his own handiwork, what does that reveal about the true nature of God's love? It's a question that completely flips the ancient world upside down, and it definitely leaves us with a lot to chew on. Thanks for joining me today. Keep questioning and keep learning.